بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. So we're still in the section that is dealing with the prostration of forgetfulness. And we mentioned a number of times that within the context of the Maliki school, that the rulings that pertain to what we call Sujud al-Sahw, or the prostration of unmindfulness, that it takes on unique characteristics in comparison to the other schools or the other madhahib, and that at times create some confusion. So it's important to um, know how to handle that. One of the how to manage the sajda sahu. And to be honest with you, one of the things that is a principle in the madhab of Malik is muratul khilaf, which is unique in comparison to the other madhahib as well. And mura'atul khilaf is often not called upon or used except in a few situations, but as a principle, we find more and more scholars kind of refer to it. And mura'atul khilaf is probably best exemplified in the example when the Khalifa in the time of Malik wanted to impose the Muwatta, the collection of hadith and fiqh that Imam Malik composed on everyone. When the Khalifa, when the ruler of the time wanted to impose the Muwatta on everyone, Malik refused to accept or even be coerced into that position. Under the premise he gave that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they dispersed to different regions in the world, and in going to different places in the world, they also took knowledge with them. And so the people of the various regions, they build their fiqh around the knowledge of the Sahaba. They build their understanding of how to practice around the knowledge of the Sahaba of the regions, of the based on the fiqh of the Sahaba who, or the Sahabi, or the companion who went to their region. So that's an example of Murat al-Khilaf, that we know that Imam Malik considered Medina to be the center of knowledge. And he considered the people of Medina to be referential and the source of knowledge. And seldom did he take knowledge from any other people or any other region. In the Muwatta, there's some reference to knowledge that came from Iraq, but it's not anything that is really significant. Not anything that's really significant uh, compared to the knowledge of the people of Iraq, compared to the knowledge of the people of Medina. I'm sorry. And sorry, I was looking at this really fast. And so sometimes in the fiqh, we ourselves have to recognize that Imam Malik took that type of approach, that although he didn't agree with their evidences, he considered their positions to be valid on the strength that they uh, ran with those evidences, although he differed with them. But the fact that they had evidences and there was some sort of grounding in their knowledge, he acknowledged that. I remember Sheikh Ahmed Taha al-Riyan, who was the head Maliki scholar in Egypt. That was apparent anyway, because that's always a tricky thing. Um, you have multiple when you can have a scholar and an imam, and there's so many people that in the world, so to speak, or even in a region, some may be known, some may not be known. So when you say that someone is the highest authority, it's from what is apparent, because there may be somebody that may be higher than that person in knowledge, but not necessarily show themselves or may be unknown to the people. Right. So from what is apparent, Sheikh Taha Ahmed Riyan was the head of the Malikis, and in part because of position in Al-Azhar as well, and so on and so forth, teaching and so on and so forth, recognition. He took over Sheikh Sadiq al-Adawi, uh, who was another Maliki scholar um, in Egypt. And he kind of inherited the Sheikh Ismail Sadiq al-Adawi. He took over the position that he had. And Sheikh Sadiq was interesting because he used to teach the madhab with dalil, with evidences. Right. So Sheikh Ahmed Tahiriyan would teach the Muwatta and Subh al-Salam, as well as Nail al-Autar, interestingly enough. But he taught Nail al-Autar in his house. And he would teach Subh al-Salam, which is the explanation of Balugh al-Maram. The one that we have in English is not anything in comparison to what is in Arabic. Um, but that's a little bit of background. That is a little bit of background with regard to Sheikh Ahmed Taha al-Riyan. He he took that position, and that's important to understand because there's a lot of confusion with regard to study fiqh. So, you have, especially now, there's a push to return back to the madhahib. It's been in place for a while, but here in the US, there's been a push for the madhahib, and a lot of times is being done by people that really are just talking without a good experience in Sharia. And a lot of times it's problematic. Even recently, I was at a conference, and I'll get back to the point of the fiqh issue that I wanted to bring up, but just giving you some background. I was at a conference, and there was a discussion that came up with regard to the study of fiqh at a specific table that I was sitting. And the one brother one sheikh, he has some accomplishment in terms of publishing and so on and so forth, and he even published a particular, according to a particular school of thought with the opinions of other madhahib and so on and so forth. But he was criticizing um, the Salafi approach, and indirectly he brought up Shawkani, he brought up Neil al-Autar, and he said that he was studying that book at an early age. So I said, to me, to be honest with you, that's not a side of criticism, because firstly, Neil al-Autar is not a book for a beginner. So is you started off wrong. That doesn't mean that the people that call to the revival of hadith knowledge uh, are necessarily wrong in their orientation. You understand what I'm saying? Like, um, it doesn't mean that the people that call to hadith knowledge are wrong in their orientation. He was talking about the madhab as being a path of knowledge. And anybody that's solid in knowledge knows that the madhab is a way. You understand what I'm saying? Is it the only way? No, it's not the only way. It's a long way, and even with that, you can get stuck. Even with that, you can get stuck because there's many people that have studied the madhab and they have never transcended the differences internally in the madhab to really go deeper to focus on the usul and the evidence and the usul al-fiqh and the textual evidences, the principles and the textual evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah, and the rational based proofs in the madhab. Not everybody who studies the madhab really masters the madhab in that regard. Many of them stay stuck on certain books. And the proof of that is what's stated by many scholars and what you look at when it comes to the practice of many scholars. Even the Gomari brothers, um, I believe it was Abdullah, he said that the Malikis are not really Malikis. No, it was Abdul Aziz. He said the Malikis are not really Malikis. The Malikis are Khaliliyun. They follow Imam Khalil. And the reason why he mentioned that was because many of the Malikis have retreated from really teaching the Muwatta. So they're focused more on the Mukhtasar of Khalil, even to the extent where it's stated when asked what is the Dalil, they say the Dalil is Khalil. They utilize those types of statements that the evidence is Khalil, and the evidence is not necessarily Khalil. That's not a Khalil. Imam Khalil didn't write the uh he didn't compose the Mukhtasar for it to be in the place of the Dalil. It points to the Dalil. It points to understanding the Dalil. But that type of approach in defense of al-fiqh mujarrad an al-dalil, um, the fiqh that it doesn't present to you the evidences clearly, it it has it has made fiqh retrogress, and the other side is problematic as well. To kind of remove yourself from these types of discussions of fiqh, wherein the reason why these discussions, to we were saying the other side is problematic as well, to remove yourself from the discussions of fiqh uh, that deal with evidences, right? So you can't have just hadith based approach without any reference to um, the thought of the scholars, to correct my position a little more, because I got distracted when Hanif left. Um, you can't have just reading hadith, and you just can't have reading traditional books without You have to combine, and you have to go to the higher levels of the madhab, or you have to go to different writings, right, at a certain point. But we start off, because these are trodden paths. We can start off with these approaches of these books that are popular, knowing that at times there's deficiencies. In any event, that's kind of going off on tangents that are relevant and beneficial. But Sheikh Ahmed Taha Rayan once talked about, so we talked about Sheikh Ahmed Taha Rayan being the lead of the Malikis. He took over from Sheikh Ismail Sadiq al-Adawi. Sheikh Ismail Sadiq al-Adawi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he focused on teaching the fiqh with dalil, hadith dalil mostly. And Sheikh Ahmed Tahirian took over from that. And he was of the opinion that in the madhab, Sharh al-Saghir, or the shorter explanation, so to speak, or the smaller explanation, it is the standard. And so he was of the people who revived, uh, or the people that kept alive. He was from the people that kept alive the school of Ahmed al-Dardir. And Sheikh Ahmed al-Dardir al-Maliki, he has a masjid close to Al-Azhar al-Sharif. He passed away. Uh, he's he's over there. He's buried over there in that area as well. And Sheikh Ahmed Tahirayan would do his dars in Sheikh Ahmed in Mukhtasar al-Dardir, which is an explanation of Khalil. But he Ahmed al-Dardir criticized Khalil on some points in terms of some positions that he took. And so he would teach in that masjid. So there's a whole school of thought that's there with Ahmed al-Dardir and Ismail Sadiq al-Adawi and Sheikh Ahmed Taha al-Riyan. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked a little bit about the importance of not just surrendering um, the idea of studying hadith, or even what, yeah, I'm going to say in this way, although I don't feel comfortable in saying it, but I'll say it in this way just to be a little more diplomatic. The 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 Salafi push towards hadith and evidence, you don't surrender that because really it's above or bigger than the Salafi da'wah. This was something that the scholars across the regions, across the madhab, pushed toward with the fall of Khilafah, because the idea that was there, that especially was partly caused to the push, was that the Muslims retrogressed and fell into some sort of disgrace with the fall of the Khilafah due to not following the Sunnah. That was not a Salafi position uh, in terms of the scholars of Saudi in an isolated manner. That idea was considered by many of the scholars. And that's why you see someone like a Sheikh Uthman Fodi calling back to the Sunnah, a Shah Waliullah calling back to the Sunnah, because the books about Hadith were not being taught in a widespread way. They were being taught among the few. In Shawkani himself, same thing. In Shawkani, he talks about how there were a number of scholars in the Yemeni region that were unknown, that had transcended the bigotry of madhab-based scholarship, because it did exist, in a hardcore way. So then that brings us back to the position of Murat al-Khilaf, that when you look at respect for the other madhab and their evidences, although you don't agree, and sometimes acting upon their positions based on the fact that they have their evidence. That's something that Malik became known for. And so Sheikh Ahmed Tahir Rayan one time told the story about Hajj, that because he was living and teaching in Medina, uh, or in that area for some time. And he talked about that in Hajj, specifically in Mecca, there was a region where the people used to urinate. And so that, from what we've studied thus far, one of the conditions of Salah is purity of the place of prayer, purity of the place of prayer, and or the preconditions, we should say. And so that became a discussion. If there is an area where people praying and there has been filth or najasa that has spread in the area of prayer, and somebody prays there, is the prayer valid or not? So according to the madhab of Malik, the madhab of Malik, the prayer is not valid because there's an impurity that's there. So Sheikh Ahmed Tahir Rayan said that he stayed stuck on that for a long time. He said he was staunch on that opinion from the Maliki school. And then a brother, he gave us the impression that it was a student, came up to him and said, Sheikh, if you take that position versus the position of, and the issue came up that more specifically, the place of prayer can't be cleaned except with water. The water is what, water falling is what purifies the area of prayer. Uh, and so the issue came up, well, in the madhab of Imam Abi Hanifa, sunlight purifies the area of prayer. So once again, the Sheikh, he stayed really firm on his position that was not correct. So then he said he thought about it, and then the brother came to him and said, Sheikh, if we go with the opinion that you're saying, then thousands and thousands and thousands of people, their salah will be invalid. And so, due to that reality, what we call umum al-balwa, something that is affecting a great majority of people, and in a way that they can't protect themselves against it. The Sheikh, he was saying that, that in that regard, he took the madhab of Abi Hanifa to be correct. And for the sake of the soundness of the salah of the people. And that's how he taught us. He taught us that we always look for an excuse for the people. We find an evidence uh, to ensure that the people have something that they're standing on as much as we can. That's the contrary to what became popular, which is people looking to kind of invalidate the ibadah of other people. So in that there's a lesson of tolerance, right? That's the whole point of the long story and so on and so forth. And to say that there's evidence behind it and it's not something that is unthought of and it goes back in the past. And so when it comes to says the Sahw, it may be the case that you may end up following the Imam, right, for the sake of facilitating the situation, or it may be the case that you may lead the salah, you may follow the standard, what is commonly practiced by other people so that they don't get confused, or you have to educate them. You have to educate them on the process because it does come up. it does come up um, as to why it is that you did it that way. Why didn't you do another way? And what's the evidence for that? That because people are used to doing it in a specific way. And some people will try to argue against bringing this type of thing up. And they say, well, that's a Salafi. That's not true at all. Because if you, it has nothing to do with the Salafis. If you're in a staunch Hanafi environment, which many of these environments that are practicing fiqh happen to be Hanafi, um, you're going to be challenged on the legitimacy if people are acting with some sort of knowledge. You're going to be challenged on the legitimacy of what you do, or you're going to be kind of sidelined, right? Because you're doing something different. And the case of the sadal in the qabd in the madhab, which is the sadal is to put the hands on the side during the salah. Although I myself don't follow that opinion uh, due to a number of reasons. One, going with the other evidence. The other two is what the majority of the people follow is not that. Um, and so it creates differences in the saf from the angle of people are questioning and all that. Are you Shi? Are you not Shi? And there's a lot of things that come along with that. And also Sheikh Ahmed Tahir Rayan, his practice was that he used sadal in the sunnah and qabd in the fard, the opposite of what is taught in the madhab. And so I learned in that way and I learned how to flex with the people due to that. So just the same way they question that, you know what I'm saying? They're going to question these differences. And that's kind of one of the reasons that gave way specifically to the Salafi da'wah was that the madhahib did not know how to work with each other. And so when the differences between the madhahib emerged in a situation like the masjid, um, there was so much restriction that people would fall into that it would create problems, right? That it would create problems. And so eventually that led to confusion on and it led to bigotry and it led to each school of thought just following their school and their imam and that's it and only an imam from their school of thought. Even recently I heard something to that regard where someone was trying to impose on another person that they have to follow according to the imam of a specific madhab. That has nothing to do with the madhab. That has to do with the mentality of the people and sometimes the mentality of some scholars, right? Because you have scholars that don't have that mindset like that. And I gave some examples like that. So Sajda Sahu again in the school, it has its own rules to it. Last time we met, uh, we talked about Sajda Sahu that deals with, we talked about this Sajda Sahu here. Um, Today, not, there you go. don't know why it's not removing itself. A second. I think because I made this before, so it's not some technical glitch here. It's not allowing me to remove the highlight that I made from the past. But in any event, here, Sajda Sahu, the sujood or the sajda of forgetfulness in Salah is a sunnah act, right? And here, sunnah act is talked about as being an emphasized sunnah, an emphasized sunnah. It's not just a normal uh, sunnah as opposed to fard, so to speak. It's a sunnah mu'akkada, uh, which means that is emphasized, especially in the case to repair or to mend an error, whether that error is classified as a deficiency in the salah or an excess or ziyada or an addition in the salah, right? And that's extremely important. And I had so in reality, sajda sahu is only performed for the sunan muakkadat in the case of deficiency, right? In the case of deficiency, and so if you miss one of the sunan muakkada, then you perform sajda sahu. But you have to be aware of what actions are sunan muakkada, and we'll come back to that issue. And three or more of what they call a sunan al-khafifa, or the basic sunan of the salah, right? So the sunan of the salah break up into two types. Those that are called al-muakkadat, those that are extremely emphasized. Sunnah muakkada is that it comes close to obligation in that the Prophet ﷺ practiced these things with frequency uh, and never let them go, or there's no evidence of them being acts that the Prophet ﷺ at times left out with some frequency. No, what it shows is that the Prophet ﷺ practiced these things with frequency. And that's why they say mu'akkada, that they extremely emphasize and they come close to the level of obligation or fard. But are not, the evidence is not there to illustrate that it's an obligation. So the fard, as we pointed to before, is that which is necessary to do, and you're rewarded with its performance. And if you don't perform the fard action, then there is a punishment that comes along with that. The other side of the fard is that the language points to it being an obligation, and there's support in terms of evidence to illustrate that it is a fard. When we say something is not a fard or something is not an obligation, that's because the language and maybe some other external evidences point to it not being associated with a punishment if it left undone, or the language itself shows at some point in time that it is not something that has to be done, or sometimes the practice of the Prophet ﷺ himself. He showed that he left it off or something to that effect. So the issue of something being an obligation or not an obligation, it is not made up. It's evidence based. Now, mind you, these classifications were not present in the time of the Sahaba. These classifications began to appear in the time of the Tabi'een, more so, right? And they were there to facilitate practice, right? They were there to facilitate practice, or they were developed to facilitate practice. And it had a lot to do with the experience of uh, the later generations from the earliest generations in following up the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions themselves. Right. So it's not necessarily it's important because we mentioned this before, Sheikh al-Albani and that tendency in the Salafi da'wah, which again is important to know that the Salafi da'wah internally has tendencies. So the Saudi mashayikh, for the most part, are following the Hanbali school with a focus on the teachings of Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And sometimes the fatwa of al-Lajna Da'ima, or the scholars that came before, like Ibn Baz and so on and so forth. So they are following they have a school of thought within the Hanbali tradition. And that's normal because the scholars, the Maliki scholars of Iraq, they had their tendencies, and they were different than the people of Medina, and they were different than the people of Egypt and the people of Morocco and Al-Andalus. That's normal. Contrary to what people try to say nowadays, and they try to say, well, the Hanbali school is not their school. No, no, no. That's not sound in approach. They're a living school, and they're the only school right now that really has hold of the judiciary system and is implemented in the society overall in a way that is not just free choice, meaning that the government um, system, I'm not talking about the leader of the country, but the system itself acknowledges the madhab, and in marriage and in contracts and all that type of stuff enforces it. No other school has that level of enforcement. Um, Now the other tendency, or let me back up. So the most that you're going to get from the angle of enforcement in some countries when it comes to the madhab is you're going to get a discussion on inheritance, and you're going to get a discussion on marriage and divorce. in many cases, right? Because the colonial powers forced fiqh out of the legal system. So Saudi still has some of that. Um, in Egypt, you have again divorce and inheritance, and sometimes not even there. But in a lot of places, that's the same issue. They have their own legal system. That's a whole different discussion. Um, Lost my train of thought. Can someone remind me where we were at?
You were speaking about the tradition of how the Saudi scholars, some of them they follow their own way. Each school like had a way, and they were different within
Oh,
the school, the
okay.
sub schools. You said,
So,
and
so the tendency, Jazakumullah khairan, the tendency of Sheikh al-Albani is not that. Sheikh al-Albani was attempting to revive the way of the scholars of hadith, especially those that trek the path of ijtihad. And so you have a number of scholars of hadith that don't follow the four schools. They have their own way. And so, in part of that, attempting to revive the way of, more specifically, the Sahaba, the fiqh of the Sahaba, because you have the fiqh of the Sahaba, then you have the madhahib that come after that develop around the fiqh of the Sahaba. So sometimes, because like Imam Malik said, the Hanafi school has those Sahaba that they follow, and then you go to another region with another madhab and they have select Sahaba that they follow. That's very real. That's not a made up thing. Even Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned that the Sunnah is never captured by just one or two Sahaba. The idea of the Sunnah, you have to have the collective, right? You have to have the collective. And that's kind of what made the Hanbali madhab unique, that and the Hanbali school, because it came later after the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi schools. Imam Ahmed had one of the largest collections of a hadith out of all of them. And he didn't follow the criteria that the first two Imams, which is Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayhima, they had a criteria that was set out for collecting a hadith. And part of the criteria that they had was regional. It was regional, meaning Imam Malik took hadith from the people of Medina and wouldn't take hadith 98.9% of the time from anyone else, from any other region. Imam Abi Hanifa, Nu'man bin Thabit, that's his name, Nu'man bin Thabit, or Nu'man ibn Thabit, rahmatullahi alayhi. He he took he took a hadith from the people of Iraq, and he had conditions. And so those two madhabs out of the four madhabs are the oldest madhab, and they existed before the codification, the systematization, the writing of the sunnah, right? In terms of collecting a hadith regardless of region, that's what was the request of Imam al-Shafi'i, Muhammad bin Idris, Imam al-Shafi'i to Ahmed bin Hanbal, to collect a hadith and don't restrict yourself to whether the person is from Syria or whether the person is from Egypt, or what, as long as it's sound. So with Shafi'i came a shift in the collection of a hadith, in the way that hadith was looked at in terms of conditions. And so that's why a lot of the hadith scholarship, a lot of the hadith texts, Baykuniya and Nukhbat al-Fikr, Baykuniya not so much, but Nukhbat al-Fikr, Muqaddimah ibn Salah, all of those books are in English. Along with that came a criteria of Sahih, or for the Sahih hadith, that the older Imams didn't have. And there's a lot of detail in that. So when you start looking at the way that hadith were collected later on, especially after the time of Shafi'i and the time of Ahmed, and so on and so forth, it differs a little bit from the way the hadith were collected in the time of Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. So sometimes in the Hanbali school, you see much more openness to various practices, whereas in the older schools, you're going to find that they're focused on pretty much one practice. So in the Hanbali school, sometimes you can have more than one way of doing things. That has to do with the way that they collected a hadith. So Sheikh al-Albani was well aware of that these terminologies like Sunan al-Mu'akkada and Wajib and all of that type of stuff was not used in the same way by the Sahaba. And so at times, in the effort to revive a focus on the fiqh of the Sahaba, they bypassed the madhab and the madhab systems. And sometimes what comes with that is a sense of sloppiness if you don't have a good system in place. Not always, because they also open up trajectories of research. But for the average student of knowledge, that's not sound. For the average student of knowledge, they can make a lot of mistakes like that, right? Because the average student of knowledge needs to have some grounding. You know, the even the intermediate student of knowledge, that more is for research and so on. So things have changed a lot because when you look at people like Mashhur Hassan, especially Mashhur Hassan, because Mashhur Hassan, he studied with some of the scholars from Syria, like Mustafa Zarqa. And so Mashhur Hassan from the students of Sheikh al-Albani is very systematic compared to others. Right? So you have a number of them that have, with time they've matured. But that led to a lot of confusion. That approach, not necessarily that everything was wrong in it, but the way that people understood it, that was the approach that was saying that we need to learn, that give me the delil. Not to say that the Saudi tendency didn't do that, but that was the approach that most emphasized in the US. We need to have the delil. And that especially was highlighted with Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi, rahmatullahi alayhi. But Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi was talking to students of knowledge. The people who translated in the US created a lot of damage because that idea of give me the dalil without a curriculum, without an educational institution, and so on and so forth, it leads to chaos. The other thing is not respecting the madhab as a tool of learning, which if you look at, for instance, the Salafi Dawah in Alexandria in Egypt, they study the madhab as a tool of learning. As a matter of fact, Sheikh al-Albani himself suggested the study of Manar al-Sabil, because of the way that it was structured, which is a book in Hanbali fiqh. Although he had a number of different approaches internally, but that was never really followed uh, by many of the students in the US or the orientation that they had. So, with that, I think should clear up a lot of the confusion that sometimes it's not even the mashaykh, sometimes it's the translation, sometimes it's the students, sometimes there's just misunderstanding, sometimes it's a phase of development. That's what leads to a lot of different issues. And there's a lot of examples of that. In any event, the a lot of that stuff is being said to kind of be uh, for us to learn how to be tolerant, but be grounded in knowledge, and not just accept anything. Um, so where we left off with Sajda Sahu is that it's a Sunnah Muakkada. We mentioned the idea of Sunnah Muakkada, and we mentioned the term Sunnah Muakkada, and we talked about how it's a concept that really, began after the time of the Sahaba. We mentioned That's why we mentioned Sheikh al-Albani and so on and so forth, and what they were trying to do. They were trying to revive the earlier fiqh, right? It was a hadith revival effort. One of my teachers called it the hadith-based school. Uh, and it's not that the other schools didn't have hadith, is that the way they dealt with hadith, they have their own way of dealing with hadith based on mustalah hadith and so on and so forth. That's why a lot of times that's what you find that they study. Um, but these terminologies were not there. So in any event, the scholars, they looked at the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, some of the earlier scholars, especially in the Madhahib. The earlier scholars are stronger at times than the later scholars. Not always the case, though. Not always the case. But in the madhabs, there is a tendency that the earlier scholars are stronger than the later day scholars, in part because the later day scholars are just muqallidun. They're just following what these scholars that came before said. Not all of the scholars as well, because you have mujtahidun. You have scholars within the madhab that they stand on their own. And if they wanted to leave the madhab, they could, but they stay within the madhab for whatever reason, whether it's political or whether it's personal. Some of the Shafi'i scholars are said to have stayed in the madhab because they came to the same conclusion as the sheikh, as the imam. But they were scholars that were pretty grounded in knowledge. So the terminology that's developed is developed with intention to understand the sunnah. Um, does that mean that we don't need to focus on hadith knowledge? No. That's why I said you combine the push of the Salafi da'wah to study hadith is extremely important. But again, it's not a Salafi Saudi invention, right? It was there earlier on, it fell off. So the good student of fiqh, you can't be a good student of fiqh without really studying hadith. I mean, basic studying this at a basic level, no problem. But if you're talking about being a strong student of knowledge, then you have to familiarize yourself with hadith, hands down, and usul al-fiqh, along with the Arabic language. But at minimum, some of these things are in English. Just becoming familiar, with the hadith. Muwatta suffices in many ways because the Muwatta is basically a book of hadith that the other collections of hadith build on, for the most part, within the Sunni tradition, right? So here, when it says is a Sunnah act is not complete, is really means Sunnah Muakkada is the highest level. If not like wajib, it is near wajib or near wajib, and fard means obligation. And so if it's not that, uh, If it's not wajib, it is near wajib. It's near an obligation. So for those acts that which one fell off or they didn't perform or there was a deficiency, then the sajda sahu, as we mentioned before, is made before the salam. Now, the acts that are really followed up on, or the actions that you focus on, mostly are the sunan muakkidat. Because the lighter sunan, if you miss three, some say two, but if you miss three or more, then you make sajda sahu when we talk about the sunnah actions. So they're listed as eight, the sunan mu'akkada. So if you miss one of these, then you make sajda sahu. In the case of the sunan mu'akkadat or the emphasized sunan. These sunan are the sunan that are practiced with frequency by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam without fail. And they're in the salah. So for instance, the recitation of a surah after al-Fatiha, the second surah, is considered to be sunan muakkada or an emphasized sunnah. So that obligates sajda sahu. If you recall, some from your practice, some salawat are prayed silently and some salawat are prayed out loud. The silence and the vocalization, those two things are from uh, the Sunan. Those two things are from the Sunan that are classified as muakkadat. Every takbir after the first takbir is from the muakkadat. Saying Sami Allahu liman hamida is from the muakkadat. The first tashahud and the sitting for it is from the muakkadat. The second tashahud and the sitting for it is from the muakkadat. And these are the matters in which if you leave off one of them, then you should make sajda sahu. Right? Then you should make sajda sahu. These are classified as the sunan al-muakkadat or the emphasized sunan. The other acts that we covered in the section sunan of the salah are considered to be sunan al-khafifa, right? Or those sunnatul khafifa, those sunnahs that are lighter in weight and practice. So then you get the idea of if you miss three or more, some say two or more, and you make um sajda sahu. That's with regard to deficiency in the salah. If you miss one of these eight, or if you miss three or more of the other sunan, then you make sajda sahu. Any questions about that?
Yeah, Sheikh, one more time, could you? I had some of them. I have five of them. Could you go through the Sunnah Mu'akkada again, the heavy ones that you said if you miss one, you said the hukam is if you miss one in the salah of the heavy sunnahs, you would do sajda as-sahw, right?
Right. So
So it was you said
is the
it,
is the is the recitation of the second surah after Al-Fatiha to recite silently that which is to be recited silently, to vocalize that which is to be vocalized. Every takbir after the first takbir, which is an obligation. First takbir is an obligation. So every takbir, every Allahu Akbar in the salah after the first takbir. To say Sami Allahu liman hamida, the first tashahhud in his sitting, and the second tashahhud in sitting. Those are from the Sunan Muakkidat, which honestly, you don't find this in every uh, text. Even here in al-Akhdari is not necessarily mentioning the eight Sunan al-Muakkadat or Sunan al-Muakkadat. Is not mentioned that is not mentioned directly. It took a little bit of digging for that because usually, like in Sheikh Uthman Danfodio's smaller books and in many smaller books, they just say if you made a deficiency in the Sunnah. So that means everything is open game, right? When you start looking at when you look at the when you look at the text, for instance, when you look at the let me see, where's it at?
hey, Sheikh, I noticed in the text, the Sulama text, he doesn't have it listed the actual sitting for the tashahhud. Though you
Yeah,
mentioned it, it's not actually in here.
that's why we
I
shifted.
noticed that too.
That's why we
It's
shifted
in up
Akhdari. Uh,
Nah.
we shifted to Al-Akhdari because even with Al-Akhdari, there's some minor points like this issue that doesn't come out. That came out of an explanation of that came out of an explanation of Al-Akhdari, and is a more contemporary one. By the way, it's not a it's not a an older one. So when you look at the Sunan, they have at least in the Sulam is listed as 20. So then the question becomes, are you going to make Sajda Sahw for 20 Sunan? In terms of, You have to know these 20 sunan. And if you miss one of them, then you make such the sahw. So that's not the practice. So the lack of clarity in that point needs to be emphasized. Um, some people get frustrated with that and they say, well, what's the delil for following this and that? Even if you uh even if you were to even if you were to say, for instance, if you were to take a non-madhab based approach, you would still have to come up with some sort of system on how to deal with that. Either way, which, like I mentioned to you before, there's books that have been written like that. So you can't go by what the average brother says in a masjid. You have to go by the people of knowledge. So the people of knowledge, they have a way of dealing with that, but still you would have to categorize it. So is it because the fiqh people is a matter of ijtihad? Deen is not a matter of ijtihad. The core of it. We know that we have to pray. We know there's something that sets us out. Okay, now in some details, you got to figure it out. So the scholarship comes in and kind of works through that. That's the whole purpose of studying. So we come in and we study what the scholarship has said in that regard. It's kind of like what are the best practices in that regard. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So the da'wah to the Quran and the Sunnah is extremely beneficial, except that there has to be some mention of methodology. And saying that we follow with the methodology of the Salaf is not enough because the Salaf didn't have to deal with the problem of filtering hadith. The Salaf didn't have to deal with problems in the Arabic language. There's a number of things that they did not have to deal with. Distance from the time of the Quran and the Sunnah, this all of that. So that's why we separate between the whole dawah thing and methodology. Okay, fine. We're Sunnis, so we agree with the idea of Quran and Sunnah and following the Sahaba. That's just a Sunni point. But where we begin to differ is that you can't do this work without Islamic sciences, right? So you need to have Arabic, you need to have usul, you need to have um, sciences of hadith, you need to have sciences of the Quran, and so on and so forth when it comes to other sciences as well. And so in that, the ulama don't differ over that. The people differ over that. You know what I'm saying? But and so then it's like we have other things to do in life as well. So you can't keep it reinventing the wheel. And that's where we come back to just deal with the scholarship. So in this case, is ijtihadi the emphasis that's placed on the muakkadat and the classification. That's the dalil. The dalil for that is that is ijtihad, right? And then there's more specific evidences that come. There's what we call usul. In this case, usul means evidences. There's some hadith and so on and so forth to emphasize this point. But those 8 actions are within the context of the 20 sunan that are counted in the sulam. The book, the sulam gives us 20 acts of sunnah in the salah. Another book may differ over one or two or three. It's fine. But what's more important is to have the eight in mind to keep that consistent. That these are the actions that if I miss one of these eight actions, then I have to make sajda sahu. The other sunan, there's a little more flexibility. So I may have to miss, say for instance, I need to make sunnah really fast. I mean, I need to pray salah. And, not to be funny or whatever, but I have to pray salah before the guards may call. Or I have to jump on the road. Or I have to jump in a meeting and there's no flexibility that I have anymore in terms of time. And that's a whole different discussion on the issue of time and letting this salah go to the end of the time and this, that. That's a whole different discussion. But when you're in a pickle, so to speak. So for instance, you may leave off some of those sunnah, but you don't leave off the eight as much as possible, right? Or you work through the eight of those sunnah, right? Of course, the obligations, the fara'id is the plural of fard. The fara'id have to be in place. The sunan is the plural of sunnah. Sunan is the plural of sunnah. So the sunan that have to be in place are the muakkadat. Now, the other sunan, if you miss more than three, so to speak, then you're obligated to make sajda sahu for the deficiency. Now, we're still on the sajda sahu with regard to deficiency. So that just gives you room to understand how to navigate, life situations. That's why there's some benefit to the approach because it allows you to know how your salah is intact. And there's an actual example, not necessarily in the Maliki school, but there's an example, and I don't even know if the story is true, but there's an example in the Hanafi school in which the students of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayh, they fell into that type of situation wherein the time for the salah was extremely limited. So in order to keep to the command of praying the salah, may Allah grant us that always facilitate for us and remove any obstacles in that regard. So they divided the salah up between that which is an obligation, that which is not an obligation, and they fulfilled the obligation so that they can meet the obligation of praying the salah. They fulfilled the obligations of the salah so that the time wouldn't go out and they would know that they fulfilled the obligation of the salah, even though there had some deficiencies. The salah would still fall into the realm of being sound. Now, there's a difference between the salah being sahih and it being makbul or accepted. The acceptance part is between Allah and you, so to speak. But the sound part is between you and yourself, meaning that you have an obligation on ensuring that your salah is sound, meaning the salah should meet the requirements that are set out for it. It's not a guessing game with that regard. But that's why the knowledge of the salah is an obligation on us to know as individuals. Every person should know how to properly perform salah. Uh, any any questions in this regard?
I got a quick one. I got a quick one. All right. So just from my understanding, really quickly, just you know what I mean, just real quickly, on my understanding. I don't want to mess nothing up here. All right. So with the eight, right? So we got the reciting of more than the sort of Fatiha, right? In the first two rakas. So let's what from my understanding is meaning like if I say sort of Fatiha, let's say I don't perform my next sort of it's that's still it's a sunnah, so that requires me to now what I mean, make says the Saha, right?
Yeah.
Saha. Okay. So real quickly, I want to get to the ones that I was having a little issue with here. All right. So the first Tashahud. So you meaning like if I skip the first Tashahud on his first sitting, if I don't recite it,
Yeah.
and then on the final Tashahud, the same thing for that, right?
Right.
And let me see something. Let me see. I went ahead in my notes here. Uh, and okay, and the reciting of the silent and the out
And
loud.
the
Like,
and the takbir, every
oh,
takbir after the first takbir.
okay, all right. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you so much. I got
And
it.
the saying Sami Allahu liman hamida.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I got you.
So those are the eight. And we still didn't go into the detail. There's another detail here with regard to, say you forget to make or you don't make sajda sahu. It comes like here, it comes up here at in this section, this type of concept. You know, there's cases, and we have to go over this because this needs a little more detail. When is it the case that if you forget sajda sahu, that your salah is okay? If you perform the sajda sahu in time, say for instance you have to do a load or whatever, right? And you have to turn it in. You make your salah. I'm trying to draw a scenario. Uh, the idea here is like time is of essence when it comes to some of this stuff. Like here it says, whoever on the other hand forgets the sujood before salam should make it immediately, even if he had taken the whole year. You see that? So sorry about that. It's not I don't know today with my here it goes right here. Okay, so this point, we have to get into this point because here there may be some playroom that you may not even have time to, or you may have forgotten the such as a whole in this case of deficiency, which is what we've been covering here. We've only covered this part. We didn't cover the second. We didn't cover this part. Um, we didn't cover the additions. This is why I marked it down here. We only covered omissions or deficiencies. So I don't want to confuse it more because I know sometimes with going off on a tangent, uh, even though is kind of adds on to the circle details and other information and so on and so forth. It can be confusing. So the most important lesson to get out of this is that the sajda sahu that is performed before the salam is for deficiency. We covered that last week. But this week we added a new dimension. The dimension that we added is that there's a designated 8 sunan. Sunan is the plural of sunnah. And these 8 sunan are considered emphasized or from the muakkidat, which is that action noted as practiced by the Prophet with regularity, something that he did frequently without leaving it out, similar to the obligatory acts in the Salah. So these 8, if one of these 8 is missing, then sajda sahu before the salam is required, so to speak. Next week, we'll get into this dimension about whoever, on the other hand, forgets sujood before salam should make it immediately, even if he had taken the whole year. We'll get into this concept because it's in these details that you find flexibility. Just like, for instance, if out of the 20 sunan in the sulam, they have listed 20 sunan in the salah. Okay, here you take 8 out of 20 that you are just focused on knowing to be those priority actions. If you miss them, then you make sajda sahw. Does that make sense or no?
I believe so.
Sajda sahw, you have 20 sunan. If you miss one of those 20, do you automatically make sajda sahw? Yes or no?
If it's out of the 8 that we're looking for, then yes.
Yes.
Right?
Right. So for the other ones out of these 20, now outside of these 8 that have been mentioned, if you miss 3 or more, 3 plus, then you make sajda sahw for that. Huh?
No, no, I'm sorry. I was writing down. Sorry about that. I should have put on mute. Okay.
Here it goes right here. 3 sunans or more. So just to be brief, so sajda sahw, there's 20 sunan. Sunan is the plural of sunnah. There's 20 sunan. In the case of sajda sahw, we make it when we miss the sunan. Now, if I were to miss one sunnah, does that mean I automatically make sajda sahw?
Can you repeat that again? I didn't quite get that.
We have 20 sunnah in the salah according to the sulam or the ladder of guidance. Sajda sahu is made for the missing of a sunnah act. For, in this case, forgetting the sunnah act. So if I miss one sunnah, do I automatically make sajda sahu? According to
I'm
what?
I'm assuming we're gonna go back to the same answers earlier. As long as if it's one of the eight, yes. If it's not one of the eight, no. But
Okay,
if we miss more, three, then we miss three plus more out of the whole 20, then yes.
okay. So we got it. That's simple as that. The 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 next lesson will deal with sajda sahu after the salam, and then we'll work our way to the issue of time. What about if we forget to make sajda sahu? You know. So those are
And
questions, but we can stop there. And I apologize for the lack of clarity on some issues.
no, no, we're good.
So that's good. I mean, that means that you got the lesson, you know. That means that you got the lesson.
Just because I'm quiet doesn't mean I ain't listening. I'm just like I'm trying to gather what you're saying because usually, from what I'm taking from you, is that you come in with the lesson and then you circle around and then you push your sweat back in a little bit more and come out of it, and then all of a sudden the answer is there. Like boom, like oh okay, I got you. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, you learned because I have a kind of a weird way of teaching in that regard,
It's cool.
a weird way of communicating. So it's like if you learn the technique, because usually, like for instance, I put a lot of emphasis today. I went back on this idea here of no, this is not so I put a lot of emphasis on this idea of the Sunnah Act. So the idea of terminology, Sunnah Muakkadah. So then I tried to incorporate also why sometimes there's confusion in the community, in part, how does the Salafi da'wah deal with that? And why is it that there's some confusion? So I tried to teach on that point as well that a segment of the Salafi da'wah was attempting to go way back to the revive the fiqh of the Sahaba. Well, the fiqh of the Sahaba doesn't have these types of things. Doesn't classify the salah into an obligation. There's an act as an obligation, an act as a sunan that you do, that you have these muakkadat in the sunan. No, we learned that before, and I mentioned Shah Waliullah, rahmatullah alayhi, he mentions that in the book Al-Insaf, that's published in English. Even Hujjatullah al-Baligha, Hujjatullah al-Baligha uh, is the eloquent proof, so to speak. In that book, he mentions that there's another way to translate it. He mentions that the terminology did not exist. Is translated as the conclusive argument, but that's not. He mentions that these terminologies, mustalahat is the plural of mustalah. Mustalah is a term. These terms didn't exist in the time period of the Sahaba. These things were crafted. This terminology was crafted to facilitate understanding by the scholars later on. The classification of actions in the Salah into that which is an obligation, that which is a sunnah, that which is other than that. It it also it has its basis in the Sahaba and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam more so. But the clarification, the elucidation, the clarification, the categorization, all that type of stuff came later on. Why do we have it? I try to emphasize that today. We have it to facilitate. So in these situations, like if you're in a pickle or you miss something, is your salah invalid? How do you correct it? Can you correct it? Can you not correct it? All those questions come up. So the scholarship is there to facilitate so that people have a system of dealing with Quran and Sunnah. And that's the idea of studying in this way. Does that mean if you don't have a madhab that you're off? No, doesn't mean that. But there's a lot of work that has been done in the madhab, which is the plural of madhab. And so that was, that was the background lesson in that regard. And the other point that the issue of tolerance, because in this case, when we start talking about how the Maliki school, once again, I mentioned that already a number of times, how they deal with this issue is very different than how the other schools deal with it. So the Maliki school stands on its own in this regard. But you find that the Maliki school has mad detail in that, right? So you're not confused on that issue. Do I have to make such and such? Do I not have to make such and so? You know what I'm saying? The Maliki school, not to say that the other schools are confused, but the Maliki school is very, is putting a lot of emphasis on certain points in this regard. Every school has its pluses and minuses and its unique points, I guess. So once you learn that, and then you can see the way that other schools deal with it as well. But this is the focus right now. So that was the idea of all that background information. And also the concept of, because here comes up the concept of fard. Uh, where does that come from? That something is an obligation. Where does that come from? And so that comes from the language for the most part. Do, don't do. But it's not just do, don't do. Is if you don't do this, there's a punishment associated with it. So sometimes in Quran and Sunnah, the language may seem to be like, do this, and you can't do anything else. But there's no other evidence to show that it is an obligation. Like there's no punishment associated with leaving it out. There's no, so that shows that it's not at the same level as an obligation. It's something that's heavily emphasized. You get reward for doing it, but if you don't do it, there's no consequences. It's just well, there's consequences, but it's more like you deprive yourself of blessings. It's not like the threat of punishment, that comes along with that. Right. So that's one way of looking at it. How is it that why is it that we have this concept of obligation? And then these things are set out this way because what we're trying to do is imitate the prophetic practice. It's not an issue of rules 100%. Right? The rules are just there to kind of give us an understanding. Once you learn them just like this, you start learning where the flexibility is at. And then you see the benefit of the rules. Now, one of the reasons why you don't immediately, in this case, there's no immediate start with evidences like from hadith and all of that, is because this by itself has its own you have to be able to conceptualize the issue clearly in your head. Then it's easier to learn the evidences. That's one approach. It's just one approach towards knowledge. There's other approaches. Some people come and they head on, they're teaching you the hadith and this, that. But then what ends up happening is people come and they say, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? So the fiqh comes in and is trying to resolve those questions before they're asked, right? Some people just say, well, they shut it down, those types of questions, but no, they remain for a lot of people. What do I do in this scenario? So that's kind of the idea of the fiqh, is to guide you. But again, it's ijtihadat, meaning it's coming. The knowledge is coming from the effort of the scholars to understand. The difference is that you have a number of scholars working together, right? It's not just one person. You have a number of scholars working together. So that's kind of like a summary of what we covered.